In the fall of 1987, local news channel WSB TV2 of Atlanta, Georgia, was attempting to fill a scheduling gap in their Sunday morning lineup. After a few solicitations by local business owners, they decided to allow the young Reverend Marley Sachs to take the available hour block to do a religiously themed show. It premiered October 18th, with little promotion. The show was standard religious fare and consisted of the Reverend sitting in a simple chair, reading passages from the Bible to the camera, and discussing their interpretation and significance to our modern, day-to-day life. The show received a reasonable number of viewers and continued to be shown into early December. It was then that the studio began to receive extremely strange complaints from viewers of Words of Light with the Reverend Marley Sachs. The calls were from women, and women only, who vaguely referred to uncomfortable feelings that they had at very specific intervals during the program. They described feelings of nausea, back pain, dizziness, and blurred vision. These callers, for no discernible reason, were convinced that it was the viewing of this program that was causing these symptoms. It was later determined after 3 weeks of complaints that these feelings were happening at roughly 12-minute intervals during the course of the program. The small studio staff checked all recording equipment, both audio and video, and found nothing faulty. When the Reverend was made aware of these incidents, he merely shrugged and stated, cryptically, that some can't handle the voice of God. The head of the studio, at a loss to explain the cause of these complaints, decided to continue running the program. By February, viewership had dropped sharply, and it was decided to pull the plug on the show. The studio had figured it would be more prudent to spend as much time as possible on the news story that had the other 2 local news networks abuzz: the miscarriage epidemic. Starting sometime in November, the number of healthy pregnant women miscarrying in the Atlanta metropolitan area had reached over 300. The CDC could find no discernible cause for this terrifying occurrence. The Reverend took the show's cancellation with what could only be described as abject indifference. When informed, he made no protest, merely nodded, almost knowingly. He left the studio after the last episode was filmed without so much as a word and dropped off the face of the earth. No one ever heard from him again, not his former congregation or any member of the church. The studio moved on, filling the slot with an infomercial, and continued to concentrate on the miscarriage story. A year and a half later, an intern at the WSB studios discovered the tapes of the Words of Light and began going through them in an attempt to find stock footage for an upcoming piece the station was doing on the impact religion had on the city. The Atlanta incident, as the miscarriage epidemic became known in medical journals, petered out 3 months after the studio canceled Reverend Sachs' show and had already begun to fade from the public conscience. As the intern went through the tapes, he accidentally made a disturbing discovery about the footage. While attempting to stop one recording at 10 minutes and 45 seconds, he mistakenly jammed the fast-forward button down. While the footage whizzed by, he attempted to pry up the button with a screwdriver. Just as he succeeded, the tape stopped at 32 minutes and 1 second. The intern actually fell out of his chair when he looked up at what was frozen on the screen. The image of a badly decomposed, severed head filling up the entire frame. After he collected himself, He moved the film back a few frames, then forward, and realized that his mind was not playing tricks on him. He began going through the rest of the recording, and soon discovered that at exactly 12-minute intervals, the image would appear for one frame. Thinking it some practical joke being played on the new guy, he presented it to one of the film technicians, ready to be mocked. The technician was just as puzzled as him. No one had touched the footage since the cancellation of the show. After the studio had closed for the night, the intern convinced the tech to help him go through all the tapes of the Words of Light. They discovered that every single episode had the same horrifying anomaly. They also realized that as the show progressed, the image had become more disgusting, as maggots began to eat away at the loose flesh, and pieces of hair and skin seemed to have fallen off exponentially. The tech made clear to the intern that what they were seeing was technically impossible, since the film itself showed absolutely no signs of splicing, and he himself had been at every filming of the show and knew of no time when this image could have been inserted into the frame. All of this was presented to the studio head, who, fearing some kind of backlash over allowing this to get on the air, ordered all the tapes destroyed. He told the intern and tech that he had no interest in knowing who did it at this point, only that covering their collective asses is all that's important now. He demanded that they mention this to no one. The tech easily moved on, remembering the incident as a darkly funny personal anecdote. But the intern wouldn't let it go. He made copies of as many tapes as he could before they were wiped, and took them to see if he could find anything else in them that might point to who did this or why they would. A week later, he attempted to rope the tech into helping him again, saying that he believed he had discovered something even more disturbing than the images themselves. When the single frames were edited together in chronological order, the head's mouth appeared to be moving as if trying to form words. The tech, fearing for his job, told him to get rid of the copies, did not talk about it again. A week later, police responded to a 911 call made by an elderly woman in one of the Atlanta suburbs at dusk. She had heard horrible noises coming from her next-door neighbor's house, where a young couple lived. She told the emergency responder that the wife was pregnant and that she was terrified that something had happened. When the officers arrived on the scene minutes later, they found no lights on in the windows and the front door ajar. They moved in slowly and made their way into the living room. Inside, they found a young woman, dead, her abdomen slashed open. The wound was jagged, and a trail of blood led from the body to the couch on the far end of the room. There, her husband, the studio intern, naked, the corpse of his unborn child at his feet, dying. In his hand, he held a rusty piece of metal siding he had used to gut his pregnant wife. The television was on and playing an 18-second loop of silent footage of a decomposing head, mouthing some unintelligible words. The story at the police precinct to this day goes that the intern kept saying under his breath, over and over again, as they led him away, "The light of God calls them." As a child, I grew up in a small southern Missouri town just north of the Ozark mountain range. There were about 10,000 people living there, and for the most part, they preferred to keep to themselves. It was a weird mentality you never ran into often in the South. During the summer following my second year of elementary school, all of that would change. In this town, there was only one provider for television. It was an old cable provider known as Ozark Cable, which served southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. It only broadcasted 10 channels, and given that satellite wasn't available within 100 miles of my town, I had to make the best of it. In fact, the only children's programming available was Tom and Jerry reruns, which broadcasted out of Little Rock on Saturday mornings. Needless to say, my options for cartoons weren't particularly extraordinary. At the beginning of summer vacation, following second grade, my family received a notice from Ozark Cable, as did the other 10,000 residents in town. The statement noted that a new, high-tech broadcasting station was to complete construction just north of town. In addition, my town would now be receiving 30 new channels, including Nickelodeon. I was as excited as any child my age would be. I would finally be able to watch new cartoons anytime during the week. During the third week of summer vacation, the broadcasting station went operational, and my small town finally entered the digital age. Static no longer interrupted regular programming. Show lineups no longer switched without notice. And, of course, I finally had Rocko's Modern Life. Overall, I was a pretty happy 7-year-old. That's when it started. I heard it first from one of my friends. Apparently, his parents had been watching late-night entertainment around midnight, or 1 in the morning, when sporadic interference in the broadcast began to occur. Images of an eyeless man flashed on the screen for seconds at a time, accompanied by startlingly loud white noise. Apparently, it was loud enough to wake my friend up. Unsettled, his parents contacted the cable provider and notified them about the incident, and were subsequently told that it would be looked into. However, the problem persisted. Eventually, it became so frequent and widespread through the town that my parents actually prohibited me from watching any television between midnight and dawn. Not that I was interested in doing so anyways. Soon, no one watched any late-night television. There were rumors of TVs sporadically turning on and displaying the eyeless man, seeming to reach out towards the viewer. They were just rumors. One Thursday morning, while my dad was at work, my mom needed to run into town and pick up a prescription from a local pharmacy. Normally, I was forced to accompany her on her daily expeditions into town, but after begging to stay home to watch the new episode of Ren and Stimpy, she surrendered and left to run her errand. After sneaking a few cookies, I sat in front of the TV, waited for the episode to begin. The episode began, as usual, with a catchy theme song and glimpses into the antics of the characters. Then, the picture went black. You can only imagine how enraged I was. I had been waiting all week for this new episode, only to have the channel go out. After parading around the TV room in a fit of childhood frustration, I sat in front of the television and waited for the broadcast to resume. A brief spark of static appeared on the screen, and I sat in eager anticipation for the episode to resume. Images of decomposing and disemboweled bodies filled the screen, accompanied by ear-piercing screams that filled the house. I immediately ran out of the TV room, but not before looking back at the television. A A man with bloodied holes for eyes seemed to approach the screen, with his livid, decaying arms reaching out. I hid under the dining room table and began to sob hysterically. In my fit of nauseated terror, I vomited onto the floor. When my mother came home, she seemed to jump back at the noises that consumed the house and immediately dropped her bags and pulled me out from under the table. I was hysterical and my face was pale with fear. Before I could answer my mother about what was going on, she entered the TV room. The screaming stopped. She unhooked the television. When I finally told her what had happened, we heard a knock on the door. It was my friend and his parents. He was sobbing and was hiding his face against his mother's shirt. They experienced the same thing I had. Everyone in town did. Almost immediately, local law enforcement became involved due to the nature of the images. After a week of no television and sleeping in my parents' bed, the local police department issued a statement. It wasn't as conclusive as we had wished. About 5 months before the original notice in regards to the new broadcasting center, Ozark Cable bought a piece of land that belonged to a long-abandoned sanitarium and on-site burial ground. In addition to demolishing the decrepit building, over 200 bodies were exhumed and cremated without warrant to make room for the miles of underground cables. Ozark Cable was immediately fined and its owner was prosecuted. After 3 months of legal battles, the cable company eventually shut down, with satellite television taking its place soon after. The source of the images remains unknown. It is also unknown how the broadcast even happened in the first place. When you're 5, your mind lacks the experience to make informed judgments or connect things which aren't obvious. Over the years, the details get fuzzy and forgotten. Speaking with my parents the other day, they cleared the cobwebs, burying the story. I remember now, much too clearly, the story of Gurgles and Bugman. I just started kindergarten that year. Everyone's a friend when you're 5, so I had no shortage of classmates. But coming from a poor family, I didn't get to see much of them outside of school. My parents spent all their waking hours trying to make ends meet and didn't have time to ferry me from house to house. So, I spent my early years mostly keeping to myself, playing with the random assortments of knickknacks from the shelf in my room. Being short of money gave my family a habit of hoarding, so they hated to throw anything out. One particular item on the shelf was a small, old-fashioned TV set. A wooden veneer box about 2 feet wide by a foot tall. It had a curved glass screen that took up half the front panel. Beside the screen was a large, chrome dial used to switch the channels. At the top sat an antenna formed by 2 terribly twisted wires. When my boredom made me turn it on, I'd usually just get static and snow on that glowing black and white screen. I'd twist the heavy clicking dial, hoping to pick up some local broadcast. Mostly it would be some ghostly images and incoherent sound fragments. But one channel was always crystal clear. It was the Gurgles and Bugman show. Gurgles was a clown, but not a common one. He wore a thin black suit that draped his tall, skinny body with a matching tie, and oversized novelty clown shoes to complete his distinctive outfit. His pupils were completely black, like polished ebony marbles, with no trace of white around them. Black face paint around those eyes and across his cheeks and mouth made him look like a manic, grinning skeleton. It was only the crazy crop of curly hair sprouting out of the sides of his head that gave him a more human look. As much as Gurgles freaked me out, Bugman scared me more. He was short and round, like a hunchbacked dwarf, with a dark cape. He had prosthetics covering his eyes to make him look like a fly, and a mouth that was rotated 90 degrees and open from side to side. The show itself was like candid camera, with pranks played on unsuspecting people. It would always start with Gurgles and Bugman hidden away at someone's home. Gurgles would face the camera, staring at you, his bony finger touching his lips. When the unsuspecting star of the show came into view, a laugh track would begin to play. You would see them go about their nightly routines, oblivious to the conspiracy that Gurgles and Bugman had involved us in. We'd see them making dinner or on the lounge watching TV with their family or quietly doing their homework, then watch as Gurgles and Bugman stole their pen or moved their glass or made things disappear behind their backs. The camera angles would change as Gurgles and Bugman shifted their hiding place from the dark corners of a room to the cupboards, to the ceiling, or under the furniture, all the while looking back at you and winking. The closer they got, the louder and more laughter from the soundtrack. Eventually, when everyone went to sleep, a victim would be chosen for their prank, waiting in the closet or under the bed. Once their victim fell asleep, Bugman would crawl out and gently climb in beside them. His jaw would open sideways, and out would come a sharp straw that he'd stick into the person's neck. This always paralyzed their victim, because sometimes you could see them struggle if they woke and saw Gurgles and Bugman on top of them. The laugh track would then be extra loud and uproarious those few times the victim awoke. Gurgles would make faces at the camera while the audience laughed, and Bugman would use a straw to drink from the person's neck. When the victim stopped struggling after a few minutes, the laughter would turn to claps and cheering. With Bugman finished, Gurgle's face would fill the whole screen with his impossibly wide, sharp-toothed grin. Then he'd whisper, "See you again, soon." The way those all-black eyes pierced through the screen always gave me the chills. I hated the show. Would always be too afraid to go near the TV while it was running. One day, the TV mysteriously disappeared from my room. My parents told my 5-year-old self that they sold it to pay some bills. I accepted that without question. I was kinda glad it was gone. But yesterday, when I asked them about that TV again, they exchanged nervous glances, then filled in some missing gaps from my childhood. Halfway through that year, Derek, a classmate I didn't know very well, had died in horrific circumstances. He was murdered in his bed with a stab wound to the neck. No evidence of a break-in was ever found. so his distraught parents were taken into custody as the primary suspects. They denied all the allegations against them. At the time, Mrs. Nolan, my teacher, told our class, and I'd apparently explained to her that Derek couldn't be dead because I saw him and his family on the Gurgles and Bugman show the day before. When Mrs. Nolan mentioned to my parents what I'd said, they had immediately taken the TV from my room, driven it to a junkyard, and had it burnt to nothing but ashes, molten metal. That TV was in my room because it had always been broken. It was never plugged in the whole time it sat on my shelf. Whatever I saw on that screen, it wasn't from a station. So that's my story of Gurgles and Bugman. But I'm not sure if that's really the end though. After all, do Gurgles and Bugman still perform their nightly show for some unsuspecting viewer somewhere in this world? And if so, who will be their next star? When I lived in my first apartment, one of my few possessions was a small television. This was before forced digitalization by the government, and the television only received a few channels. One channel simply marked Component 1 caught my attention immediately. I don't know how or why, but this channel displayed security feed from some high school in silent grayscale. The feed would cycle through different cameras around the building. At first, I thought the school might have been the high school near my apartment, though having private televisions accidentally pick up the security feed seemed like something that should have been easily prevented by using a closed circuit. And it was especially confusing why it would show up on my TV's component channel. But certain camera feeds, especially from the parking lots and outside of the building, made it clear that the school was not local. I never did figure out where the school was, but I developed a voyeuristic fascination for the feed. I understood the phenomenon of people watching. There is something strangely gripping about being a fly on the wall as people go about their daily lives, like you're stalking NPCs in a video game. Like I said, my television didn't get many channels, so I often had Component 1 running in the background while doing other things. One time, while I was watching the feed, an earthquake happened at the school. I didn't feel it, confirming that the school was not near me. The camera shook, objects fell, and I saw students and staff running for shelter. The shaking stopped after a few moments, and after a couple minutes, the evacuation began. While everyone was filing into the hallways and leaving the building, there was an aftershock. The aftershock was worse. People were knocked down, and ceilings in some rooms collapsed. Some cameras went dark. The aftershock ended, and the evacuation continued. But sometimes I would catch a glimpse of someone who was injured and unable to move or unconscious. Some cameras I was familiar with were now only recording a small corner of the room, having been knocked off center by the quake. Smoke began filling several rooms and corridors, especially the cafeteria. Gas lines ruptured. One shot of the front parking lot showed smoke billowing out of the building. I could also see that cars had drifted and power lines had been knocked down. Horrified, I flipped through the other channels to find coverage of the event. But there was none. No breaking news, and even scheduled news programs said nothing about an earthquake or a school fire. I switched back to Component 1. By now, most cameras were completely filled with smoke. I saw first responders begin to enter the building and start pulling out people. I thought maybe I could help by showing someone the feed on my TV. I called the police, hoping they could contact emergency services wherever the school was in case their security feed was inaccessible, and they could use the information. The dispatcher was confused about what I was trying to convey, but 2 officers did come to visit me. While I was waiting for them to arrive, there was another tremor. I saw debris fall on top of first responders, and after a few seconds, the feed went entirely dark. The police thought I was playing a prank. They told me there were no reports of a major earthquake anywhere in North America, let alone a school disaster. I asked them to find out about the rest of the world. They checked and told me there were no reports from anywhere else either. I never got back the Component 1 feed. To this day, I've been unable to find any reports of a school earthquake disaster from that date. Picture the scene. It's late one night, around 1 a.m. Pitch black darkness, with the only company being the sound of speeding cars on the motorway above. 2 men stand below it. One covered head to toe to hide his identity. One, a failed TV presenter looking for a second chance. The 2 met on Craigslist, as he was browsing for anything that could bring back the revival of his career. On the verge of giving up on everything, ready to take his own life, he found an ad that piqued his interest. What would you give for fame? When he clicked the ad, all he saw was the name of a motorway and time. He knew it was probably just a joke, a silly little ad that a few teens put up there to make a fool out of people. But yet, he felt drawn to it, compelled to go there and see what it truly was. So, he went, and that is where our story starts. The 2 men exchanged glares until the motorway above was silent. "Are you ready?" said the mystery man, in a deep, emotionless tone. The staring continued. "Edmonds," I asked, "are you ready?" Edmonds stared, the cold night wind blowing his hair. He slowly nodded as the man proceeded a slip of paper, a contract with no words written upon it, only a dotted line to be signed. Edmonds wanted to put a fake signature, just in case this was some elaborate scam. But once again, he found himself to be too trusting. He signed it with his usual N. Edmonds, and then blacked out. He woke several hours later, refreshed and smiling. He scratched the back of his neck, trying to remember his whereabouts, peeling plaster off his neck. He assumed when he blacked out that he had fallen on it, and thought nothing more of it. He set off home and went back to his day-to-day life, assuming that it had just been a dream or a side effect of all the medication he was taking to deal with his depression. Then, he became aware of the fact that he wasn't depressed. Not anymore. He wasn't angry, happy, upset, or depressed. He felt empty, like something had been taken from him. After a few days of feeling like this, he'd grown used to it and had forgotten all about the events of that old night. He sat at home, eating cereal and watching TV when the phone rang. It was rare for him to get a call. He didn't have many people left in his life that would call him, let alone anyone at 3 in the afternoon. It was an executive producer from Channel 4 telling him news of a game show that they want him to host. Edmonds accepted, and within the week, filming had begun. The premise of the game show was simple: 22 boxes with various sums of money in them, ranging from 1 cent to $250,000. There would be 23 contestants, 22 with the boxes, and 1 chosen to play. But on the first day of filming, Edmonds demanded a change. He requested only 22 contestants. 1 would bring their box to the table. He also asked for a third person to be in the spotlight, an unseen friend of his. He called him the banker, a mysterious, unknown voice on the other end of a telephone. The banker resembled the new Edmonds: cold, heartless, uncaring, with eyes only focused on money and materialism. As the game show became more and more popular, the banker would become crueler and more desensitized to the contestants' feelings. People that were in dire need of his money would be offered much less for the contents of their box, being taunted by his maniacal laugh. All the while, Edmonds stared at them, urging them to go on with the game. He knew the banker's secret. He knew that when the person dealt, they gave their life away. The only way to keep your humanity was to play until the end. Edmonds didn't want them to deal. He didn't want them to suffer the same as he did. He didn't want them to sign the contract. He gave his soul for fame. He became empty. But the banker wanted more from him. Edmonds' fame was the doorway for people to sell their soul for a small fortune. Their life, like his, was decided by one simple phrase: deal or no deal. There are generally 3 main reasons one doesn't talk about their job in polite company. The first is that the job is dull or hated to the point that talking about it is almost painful, or at least pitifully boring. The second is that an employer has set down rules about what can and can't be told to outsiders. The third is that one does not have a job that can appropriately be discussed in polite company. My job, I suppose, is a little of all 3. After 10 years of reviewing illegally imported audiovisual material, I have seen pretty much all there is to see of humanity's sickness. Perverted sex, murder, and mutilation have all become routine. Of course, I can't talk much about the things I've seen, nor would people want to hear about it. What may interest you, though, is a little urban legend I heard back when I started this job, back when the sight of violence and death still had a profound effect on me. I was told by a man I will refer to only as George that among our profession there is an urban legend. The legend of Amy's video. According to George, the story goes that after so long on the job, people in this job can become desensitized to the extreme violence and cruelty that we witness every day. This phenomenon happens around the world, apparently, wherever our job is undertaken. When one of our people really loses it, George told me, they create their own videos, their minds poisoned by all that they have witnessed. They then send their video internationally through the post or by giving it to some poor, unsuspecting soul who brings it across the border. These videos are filled with violence, perpetrated by one of our kind who has gone over. Their content: murder, torture, rape, mutilation. And their victims: men, women, children, animals. It changes between videos, reflecting the maker's preferences and tastes. There are, however, two distinguishing features of the videos. First, a symbol of a stickman painted in blood somewhere during the course of the carnage. A secret handshake, George said, of those who have gone over. Second, the video was always disguised as a normal video, containing the name Amy. The title could be Amy's Wedding, or Amy's First Steps, or simply, For Amy. This way, they could be identified by others of our kind. I didn't really believe this story at the time. I was young and naive, believing that I could never become accustomed to the horrifying images that I witnessed on screen. Never mind considering that one could be convinced to create such carnage themselves. And as the years went by, I became more and more convinced that it wasn't real. We were the protectors after all. It was 6 months ago that the DVD came in. A young man with an extensive stash of pornography from Thailand had it, amongst other dubious content. It was called Amy's Awakening, and judging by the broken English on the cover, was a standard bland porn fare. It was the name, though, that caught my attention. When it fell to me to check the DVDs for illegal content, I held that one in my trembling hands, wondering, for the first time, if it could really be true. I studied the cover, sitting in my ergonomic computer chair. I turned the case over and over, looking for some way to ease my anxiety. My gaze settled upon the blurb, the usual claptrap that passed for a plot. 3 words were in bold, and I was drawn to them. You are entitled. That wasn't what made my heart pound. No, it was the copyright symbol at the bottom. Stickman Enterprises. It had to be a coincidence, right? With unsteady hands, I put it in the DVD player. It had been taped over a legitimate porn movie, or maybe the movie had been specifically made for it. Who knew? I relaxed, thinking that everything was okay, until the screen flickered and changed. The 2 young girls were Asian, 15 or 16 years old, maybe. But I couldn't tell anything about where the movie was filmed. The camera didn't move unless manipulated by the man in front of it. A tall, well-built man in a ski mask. It seemed like he was the director as well as the star of this little snuff film. I don't care to tell you what unspeakable acts took place on camera, what atrocities were committed to film. It wasn't pretty. The stick man on the bathroom tiles, though. That was what made my heart really race. It was true. It was all true. Watching the blood flow, watching the bathtub fill with it. And it was like a revelation, a sign that our kind, the moral authority, could subvert the norm, could inflict upon the world what we had to endure ourselves for so long. If you ever become one of us, you are entitled. It may take years of training, but eventually you will come around. I didn't believe it either at first. I didn't think it was possible, but I was capable. But the divorce papers my wife served on me today, they made my heart sing. It's a sign. A new chapter in Amy's history is coming soon, and I will not miss it.